Take my obese daughter, she's useless, the father begged the passing mountain man. His voice cracked with cruelty, not desperation. He pointed to the girl like she was a sack of grain too heavy for his wagon, too shameful for his name. Folks still talk about that day, when a man traded his own blood for freedom, and a stranger paused on the trail to look her in the eyes. She was 15, big-boned, soft-faced, silent. He was a reclusive figure wrapped in furs and ghosts, the kind of man who didn't speak unless it mattered. Why would a father cast off his own kin? And why would a feared mountain man, hardened by loss and wilderness, take in a girl the world had thrown away? This tale ain't about pity, it's about purpose, redemption, and the wild places where broken souls find each other and fight to heal. When a father's shame became a girl's sentence, and a mountain man paused where most would ride on, one question lingers. Who truly saw her worth, and who was too blind to care? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how these frontier stories still bring us together, across fences, time, and struggle. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still live in your heart, then you're already part of this story. Let me know which estate you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep sharing tales that matter. Take my obese daughter. She's useless, the father spat, his voice cutting through the thin mountain air like a rusted knife. His wagon rattled behind him, the oxen restless, their breath steaming in the cool dusk. He gave the girl one last shove. She stumbled, heavy in her frame, then fell hard to the dry earth. Dust rose around her like smoke. A rock scraped her palm, and blood welled up bright and stubborn. She didn't cry. She didn't even make a sound. Her thick braid lay limp across her shoulder, coated now with dust, her dress torn at the hem. Her face was red, not from shame, but from the heat of swallowing too many words for too many years. Boone Callister stood on the ridge above, a shadow half-eaten by the slope of the late sun. He wore a thick coat of furs and leathers patched over the seasons, a wide-brimmed hat low over his brow. His beard was silver and wild, and his eyes, though narrowed, saw everything. He had heard the man's voice from up the trail, heard the cruelty wrapped in each word. He hadn't intended to come down. But some things pull a man from his solitude, even after all he's lost. The girl sat up slowly, brushing the dirt from her dress with hands too gentle for this world. The man, her father, snorted. Ain't good for nothing. Eats like 10 men, cries like a baby. All yours, stranger. She'll slow you down and wear out your boots. Boone didn't speak. He stepped forward with the weight of mountains in his bones, boots crunching on dried pine needles and brittle grass. He stopped a few feet from the girl. She looked up at him, not in fear, but with a quiet waiting, like she'd already accepted whatever came next. Her eyes were wet but unblinking. Sad, yes, but proud. And somewhere in their gray-blue depths, Boone saw something flicker, a memory, a fire long extinguished. Her father shifted, suddenly unsure. Well, say something. Boone didn't answer. He reached down and held out his hand. The girl hesitated just a breath, then placed her scraped, shaking fingers into his. His grip was strong, warm, steady. She rose to her feet, stiff from the fall. Boone turned away from the road, toward the thick wall of trees that loomed behind him like sentinels. Without a word, he walked, and the girl, Mabel, followed. Her father barked laughter. You'll be bringing her back before week's end. She'll eat your stores bare and moan all night. Boone didn't turn. He never looked back. They entered the forest as the last edge of sunlight caught the tip of the valley. The world behind them darkened. The world ahead was darker still, but the line between them, where their shadows stretched and merged, was the beginning of something neither of them could name. The wind stirred the pine branches high above. A hawk cried somewhere in the distance. And the wagon wheels rolled on, down the mountain trail, carrying a man too empty to feel what he'd just thrown away. The trees closed in like old judges, silent and tall, their gnarled arms filtering the dimming sky into long bars of golden dusk. Mabel stumbled over a root, caught herself, and kept going. The forest floor was uneven and damp, coated in needles and moss, with thorns that clung to her dress and caught at her ankles. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. Her boots, never meant for this terrain, rubbed raw against her heels. Every step hurt, but she said nothing, not one complaint. She followed Boone Callister, whose wide back cut a path through the underbrush without a glance behind. He moved like a man born of trees and silence, steps deliberate, posture upright, as if he belonged to the mountain and the mountain knew it. He didn't speak, didn't offer help, but when the trail grew too steep, he paused. When her legs shook beneath her, he waited. He didn't offer a hand, but he gave her the gift of not leaving. It was more kindness than she'd known in years. By the time the last light faded, her legs trembled with each step, and her lips were cracked from the dry wind. Boone led them down to a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The water ran fast and cold, tumbling over stones slick with moss. He pointed to a flat patch of earth beneath an overhanging pine, then set to work building a fire without a word. Mabel sank to the ground, grateful, sore, and silent. The fire caught quickly. Boone stirred a pot of stew over the low flames, steam rising like a ghost into the night air. When it was ready, he poured half into a tin cup and placed it near her feet. Then he sat back, eating in slow, quiet bites, his eyes lost to the fire. Mabel took the cup with both hands. It was rabbit and root vegetables, seasoned simply. It tasted better than anything her father had ever fed her. She didn't thank him. She didn't know if she should. The only sound she made was the soft, broken sobs that came once she lay curled in her blanket, trying to sleep. Boone didn't look at her, but he didn't move away either. By morning, frost clung to the grass like lace. The creek murmured low and steady. Mabel blinked awake to the scrape of steel on stone. Boone sat by the fire, sharpening a long hunting knife with slow, precise strokes. Beside him lay the body of a fox, its red fur matted with blood, limp and cooling. He didn't speak, just held the knife and pointed to the fox's belly. Mabel knelt, uncertain. He showed her where to press, how to slice. The skin peeled back like parchment, and the smell hit her fast and sharp. Her stomach lurched. She turned and vomited into the grass. Boone didn't flinch. When she returned, pale but steady, he nodded once. That was all. Later, he showed her how to walk without snapping twigs underfoot, how to listen to the wind and read the trail. He taught without speaking, pointing, demonstrating, letting her fail, letting her try again. She mimicked his steps, adjusted her footing, learned to balance her weight. She fell once, scraped her knee but didn't cry. He handed her a strip of cloth for a bandage. No praise, no scorn. The day passed like that, quiet, methodical, purposeful. Mabel didn't feel like a burden anymore. She was tired, aching, hungry, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. That evening she sat across the fire from Boone. He whittled a piece of wood into something shapeless but smooth, the knife dancing in his calloused hands. Mabel stared into the flames, her eyes heavy, her heart unsure. But when she glanced up, she caught him watching her, not coldly, not harshly, just watching. She didn't know what it meant, but she didn't look away. The church bell rang low and hollow across the town of Ravel's Gap, its echo swallowed by the wind that always seemed to carry more whispers than dust. Word had spread quick. Boone Callister was back, or something like him. Folks said they saw him walking the timberline trail above the West Ridge, his broad frame cloaked in wolf hide, a shadow with eyes. And beside him, they claimed, was a girl, round as a haystack, slow-stepping and silent. No one knew her name. Some said she was a runaway. Others said Boone had taken her against her will. Most just assumed the worst. That's how towns like Ravel's Gap survived, by assuming the worst and thanking God they weren't part of it. Widow Calla was the first to say different. She saw them with her own eyes from the window above the mercantile. Boone walking ahead, the girl behind, shoulders hunched but eyes alert. Calla pressed her hand to the glass, heart pounding. Boone had vanished 10 years ago after the fire. Folks said he'd gone mad with grief, maybe took to the bottle, maybe froze to death out past Dead Man's Creek. But she saw no madness in his step, just a steady gait. And the girl, Lord help her, the girl looked tired, but not afraid. At the church that night, Calla lit a candle. She said no prayer aloud, but in her heart, she whispered a name, Boone's wife, Evelyn. Then she whispered another she didn't know. The girl. A soul thrown to the wind needed someone to catch it, even if only with a flame. Across town in the sheriff's office, Trask leaned back in his chair, boots on the desk, chewing on a toothpick. A deputy stammered, asking if he'd ride out, see if the rumors were true. Boone ain't broken no laws last I heard, Trask grunted, and the mountains'll handle what I don't. Long as no bodies show up on my porch, I ain't stirring. The wind rattled the window panes, as if to agree. Meanwhile, in the forest beyond reach of law or gossip, Mabel crouched low beside a meadow, breath held tight in her chest. A deer stood at the edge of the clearing, its ears twitching, nose testing the air. Boone had handed her the rifle earlier, just before they split to circle around. But now, as she stared at the creature, its delicate legs, its glassy eyes, the way it shimmered in the twilight like a thing made of breath, she couldn't raise the weapon. Instead, she drew in the dirt. With a stick and careful fingers, she shaped its outline, sloping back, antlers like bare branches, hooves pressed to imagined moss. Her tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth as she etched its form, slow and sure. From the tree line, Boone watched. He said nothing, made no sound. When she looked up and found him there, she expected disapproval, but he just turned and walked on. That night, the fire crackled low. Mabel sat beside it, warming her blistered hands. Boone returned from the dark, silent as always. In his arms was a folded wool blanket, frayed at the edges, patched near the hem. He handed it to her without ceremony, then sat down with his back to the fire. She unfolded it slowly. It smelled of old smoke, pine needles, and something else. Something clean and comforting, like time kept in cloth. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, and she hugged it close. She didn't know why he gave it to her, but she felt for the first time in a long while that someone had seen her. Not as a burden, not as shame, just seen. Above them, the stars blinked into place, one by one, like candles lit by someone who still believed there was good left in the dark. The cabin sat nestled between two towering pines, aged and gray, its roof heavy with moss, its chimney coughing up thin trails of wood smoke into the mountain air. Boone hadn't lived in it so much as existed beside it, the years folding over him like fallen leaves, one after another, thick and quiet. But now, with Mabel under his reluctant protection, the silence felt heavier, less earned. Something had shifted. He built the lean-to in 3 days. He didn't ask for help, but Mabel brought him nails when he ran low, held boards in place with shaking hands, fetched water from the creek without being told. It was rough, slanted, and spare, with gaps in the walls and a door that creaked like an old man's knees. But it stood. When Boone set the last beam in place, he nodded once, and Mabel understood it was hers. She moved in without a word. Days passed with the rhythm of survival. Mabel rose before dawn and split kindling with more sweat than skill. She learned to keep the fire alive through the coldest nights, stirring it with a long iron rod, feeding it carefully like it might turn on her if she wasn't respectful. Boone repaired snares and hunted game. She cleaned the catches now without gagging. Her fingers grew nimbler, her shoulders sturdier. When she washed their clothes in the icy creek, her hands turned red and numb. But she never stopped. She hung them on a line between two trees and watched them flap like ghost flags. Boone said little. He moved like a shadow between trees, always watching, never looming. At first, Mabel flinched when she noticed his gaze, but over time, it felt less like judgment and more like presence, like someone who noticed she existed and didn't turn away. One evening, while bringing firewood inside, Mabel spotted a narrow drawer left slightly open near Boone's cot. Curiosity tugged at her more than manners, and she eased it open with hesitant fingers. Inside lay a small wooden figurine, no taller than her palm. A woman, hands folded, face carved with care. The edges were worn smooth from being held too often. Mabel's breath caught. She closed the drawer gently, placed the wood by the fire, and said nothing. Later that night, Boone returned from the trail with a satchel over his shoulder. He didn't speak as he warmed himself by the fire. Then as the flames hissed and popped, he reached into the satchel and pulled out a small leather-bound book, edges frayed, spine cracked. He handed it to her, thumb resting for just a moment on the faded cover. "Was hers," he said. Mabel took it reverently. Inside, the pages were marked with soft underlines and notes in a neat, feminine hand. Poetry, gentle, aching, full of stars and rivers and longings buried under soil. She read the first aloud, voice trembling but clear. The fire cast shadows across her face as the words drifted upward into the beams. Boone sat still, head bowed slightly, eyes closed. When she finished, silence fell again. But it wasn't empty this time. It was full. A silence that held meaning, held memories, held mutual grief, and a flicker of something else. Respect, perhaps. Recognition. That night, Boone added another log to her fire before turning in, and Mabel, wrapped in the same old blanket, opened the book again and whispered the words into the dark, like a promise not just to the past, but to whatever future might dare grow in its place. The days settled into a rhythm, like a slow-turning wheel guided by patience and grit. The forest no longer felt like a stranger to Mabel. It was still vast, still wild, but it had begun to breathe with her instead of against her. Her muscles ached in familiar ways now. The cold didn't bite as deep. Her hands had stopped trembling when she held the knife, though the calluses that came in their place were still tender. One afternoon, while Boone was away checking traps, Mabel wandered into the lean-to, feeling restless. Her eyes fell on a pile of scrap wood near the chopping stump. Without thinking too much, she picked up a small piece, no bigger than her fist, and held it in her palm, weighing it. The rough texture invited her fingers to shape it. She fetched Boone's spare knife, sat on the stump, and began to carve. Her first attempt looked nothing like what she'd intended. The second wasn't much better, but there was something satisfying in the quiet scrape of blade on wood, in watching curls peel away like secrets being slowly told. Her hands moved slow, thoughtful. She didn't rush. There was no one to impress, no one to scold her for wasting time. She carved because it felt good to make something that didn't hurt. The next morning, Boone noticed the small block she'd left on the edge of the porch, an attempt at a squirrel, lopsided and stub-tailed. He said nothing, but that evening, without ceremony, his old carving tools appeared in a neat bundle on her stool. No note, no explanation, just permission. In return, Mabel started cooking more. Simple things at first: corn mush, roasted roots, bits of dried meat. But she watched Boone's habits, learned what he gathered, paid attention. One day while he was gone, she prepared a rabbit stew, broth thick with herbs, tender meat, potatoes boiled just soft enough. She didn't say anything when he returned. She just handed him a bowl. He took one bite, then another. Finally, he looked at her, nodded once, and went back to eating. It was the most she'd ever been praised. A few days later, Boone took her up a high ridge that overlooked the valley below. The hike was steep, and Mabel's legs burned with each step, but she didn't ask to stop. Boone pointed to the sky, to the color of the clouds, the direction of the wind, the shape of bird flight. "Storm's 2 days off," he said. "You'll feel it in your teeth tomorrow." She didn't know what that meant, but she smiled anyway. That night she slept soundly. The next night she didn't. The storm came early. It struck fast and violent, rattling the hills like the voice of God himself. Wind howled through the trees and lightning forked across the sky, splitting a pine just 20 feet from the cabin. The crack was deafening. The fire guttered out. Mabel screamed. Boone was at her side in an instant, grabbing her arm, pulling her from the lean-to into his cabin. The door slammed shut behind them as rain pelted the roof in sheets. The whole world seemed to shake. She crouched in the corner, shivering, her heart hammering. Boone knelt beside her, one hand steady on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, voice low but certain. It was the first time he'd spoken to her in more than one sentence. The words didn't feel like reassurance. They felt like truth. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she believed it. Not because the storm was passing, but because someone had finally chosen to keep her safe, and meant it. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees like reaching arms. The air was still, heavy with the hush that comes when something sacred lies ahead. Mabel had wandered farther than usual, following the faint path Boone often took alone. It led to a small clearing tucked into the hillside, the trees opening just enough to let in the light, as if even the forest knew to step back. There, nestled beneath a pair of slender aspens, stood two wooden crosses, simple, unmarked but lovingly carved, their edges worn smooth by time and weather. A few stones circled the base, placed with care. Mabel stopped short when she saw Boone already there, kneeling in the dirt, hat in hand, head bowed. Hey, he didn't move when she approached, didn't speak, just stayed still, his shoulders broad but quiet, like he was holding back something that might break him if he let it out. Mabel knelt beside him without a word. She reached into the small satchel she always carried now. Boone had made it for her from tanned hide, and pulled out a handful of wildflowers she'd picked earlier that morning. Bluebells, dandelions, a sprig of mountain laurel. They weren't arranged prettily, but they were bright, full of color and life. She laid them gently at the base of one of the crosses. Only then did Boone speak, voice low, graveled like dry creek bed stone. "Her name was Evelyn, my wife." He nodded toward the first cross. "And that one, that's for Lucy, our girl. She was 9. Mabel turned to him, her chest already tightening. "Fire took 'em," he said. "I was out in the north woods, setting traps. Snow came early that year. I got stuck out longer than I planned. When I came back, the cabin was gone. Ash and smoke. Just gone." His jaw clenched and he looked down at the dirt, eyes hard with memory. "Town folks said it was my fault, that I should have been there, that I left him to die. I didn't argue. What could I say?" He sighed. "So I left. Let the whispers have their way. Figured maybe they were right." Mabel swallowed, the lump in her throat thick as stone. Her eyes brimmed, and a tear slipped down her cheek, trailing through the dust. "He told me I was worthless," she said, voice soft, barely audible. "Said I was too heavy to carry, too slow to help, too big to love. My own father." Her fingers dug into the earth. "He used to call me a burden. Said I'd die alone 'cause no man would ever want me. Boone turned his gaze to her, eyes dark and steady. He was wrong, he said, quiet but firm. The words landed heavy and warm, not like pity, not like a kindness tossed her way out of guilt, but truth, solid and unmoving. Mabel looked back at the crosses, the flowers at their base swaying gently in the breeze. Boone rose and offered her a hand. She took it. That night they sat side by side outside the cabin. No fire, just stars. Dozens of them, scattered like silver dust across the black velvet sky. Mabel tilted her face upward, breath slow and steady. Beside her, Boone said nothing, but she could feel his presence like a steady flame. Safe. Sure. The stars seemed brighter that night, not because the sky had changed, but because something inside both of them had. And for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't grieving alone. The wind carried the dust of wagon wheels back into Ravel's Gap, and with it came the man who had once cast his daughter into the dirt like garbage. Mabel's father rode tall in the saddle now, cleaner than he'd been weeks before, hat cocked to one side with a swagger he hadn't earned. But it wasn't the father that made the town pause. It was the man beside him, Whit Dyer. Dyer didn't belong to the mountains. You could tell from his boots, polished, not broken in by stone. His suit was black and stiff, like it had never known sweat or ash. He smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, sharp as a knife and twice as cold. Word spread quick. He was with the railroad. Said there were plans to bring a spur through the hills. Said it would bring jobs, progress, wealth. But what he didn't say, not publicly, was that Boone Callister's land sat right where the railroad wanted to cut through. The father, suddenly cooperative, fed Dyer lies with honeyed breath. Claimed Boone had taken his daughter by force. Claimed she was too afraid to run. Claimed the mountain man was dangerous, unstable, broken beyond fixing. Sheriff Trask sat behind his desk, listening with half an ear and less conviction. He spat a wad of tobacco into a dented tin and muttered, "Ain't my concern. If nobody's dead, I don't ride." He leaned back, hands folded over his gut. Let the hills settle it. But Widow Calla had been stocking flour at the Mercantile when she overheard the talk. Her spine stiffened. She knew Boone's silence wasn't cruelty. She remembered the fire. Remembered how the town had turned its back too quickly. She wouldn't do it again. That same afternoon, she saddled her mule and rode out of town before the sun dipped low. The trail to Boone's Ridge was steep and winding, but she knew it well enough. By the time she reached the edge of his clearing, Boone was standing just outside his cabin, a rifle slung casually over one shoulder. He'd heard the hooves. He always did. His eyes met hers without warmth, but without threat either. "Calla," he said, name like a memory on his tongue. "Boone," she replied, breath catching. "You got trouble coming." From the shadows near the lean-to, Mabel stood silently, carving knife clutched in one hand. Her breath was shallow. She recognized her father's name before Calla even spoke it. "Dyer's a snake," Calla said. "Railroad man. Slick with paper and gold teeth. Your land's in his way and he's coming to take it, with men and guns, and the law paid to look the other way. Your girl's father? He's feeding him every lie he can think of." Boone didn't move, didn't blink. He stared at the trees like they'd whispered something he already knew. "Figures," he said. "Can't stand the sight of her. Now wants to use her." Mabel stepped closer. Her hands were trembling, but her chin was high. "He won't take me," she said, voice quiet but strong. "Not again." Boone turned to her. "He won't take the land either." Calla looked between them, something like hope flickering in her eyes. "You two have something they can't buy or break. Just be ready. They'll come fast." Boone nodded once, and Mabel, still holding the blade that had shaped wood into beauty, tightened her grip. Her heart beat like thunder, but this time she didn't flinch. The air turned colder as the threat grew closer, as if the mountain itself sensed what was coming. Boone didn't speak of fear. He didn't need to. His hands said enough, fastening shutters, reinforcing beams, checking every hinge and lock on the cabin. He moved like a man who'd prepared for storms before. Only this time, the lightning wore spurs and carried rifles. Mabel watched from the lean-to, her fingers tightening around the edge of her blanket. Then she stood. "I want to help," she said. Boone glanced at her, then nodded once. That was all the permission she needed. They spent the next day setting traps. Simple snares near the trail, pits lined with sharpened sticks, tripwires hidden beneath leaves. Boone showed her how to disguise them, how to read wind patterns to know which path men might take. Mabel listened hard, asked questions, got her hands dirty. The work was hard, but she didn't shrink from it. They dried meat, packed satchels with supplies in case retreat became the only choice. Boone mapped the surrounding woods with charcoal and bark, pointing to hidden ravines and deer paths barely wide enough for one. Mabel traced the routes with her finger until she could draw them from memory. At dusk, Boone placed a rifle in her hands. Her fingers curled around it awkwardly. "I don't know how," she admitted. "I'll teach you." They stood behind the cabin, aiming at a tree marked with a small X scratched into the bark. Her first shot missed wide. The second, not much better. Her cheeks burned and she tightened her jaw. "Don't grip it like you're wrangling a snake," Boone said, voice calm. "And don't aim with your anger." She looked at him, breath sharp in her chest. "Breathe. Let the world get quiet before you pull." She tried again. Missed, but closer. Then again. A chip of bark flew from the X. Boone nodded. "You'll do." That night they sat in silence near the fire. The traps were set, the food stored, the rifles cleaned and loaded. Mabel's heart thudded in her chest like a drum she couldn't quiet. Near midnight the horses came. They didn't ride up bold. They crept like wolves. 4 men, cloaked in dark coats, rifles across their backs. Mabel watched from the window, breath caught. One of them reached for a tree limb, and the trap snapped shut with a snarl of steel, catching the branch with a whip-like crack. The men froze. One muttered something low. Another pointed at the pits, just barely visible in the moonlight. After a moment's hesitation, they turned back, disappearing into the dark the way they came. "They're testing us," Boone said. "They'll be back," Mabel whispered. Boone nodded. Inside, Mabel grabbed a scrap of cloth and a lump of charcoal. She sat at the table and, one by one, began to draw the men she'd seen. Angular faces, crooked noses, a scar above one brow. Her hand moved fast, steady. Boone watched her work. "You got a memory like a hawk," he said. She looked up, surprised. Then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It was small, unsure, but real. And Boone smiled back. Just a flicker. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the mountain waited. So did the men. But for now, the two of them, an old ghost and a girl once thrown away, had found something stronger than fear. They had each other, and they were ready. The morning air was thick with mist as Boone saddled the mule and motioned for Mabel to follow. No words were spoken, just a tilt of his chin and a glance toward the east, where the mountains rose like old bones against the gray sky. Mabel didn't ask where they were going. She pulled on her coat, tucked her sketchbook into her satchel, and fell into step behind him. They rode in silence, the trail winding narrow and damp beneath pine boughs still dripping from last night's rain. Birds called from hidden branches, and the forest opened gradually into a wide valley cradled between 2 ridges. Smoke curled from a small circle of lodges by the river's bend. Children's laughter echoed faintly. Mabel sat straighter in the saddle, nerves prickling her skin. Boone dismounted near the largest lodge and waited. A man emerged from the shadows, tall, weathered, draped in a coat of raven feathers and deer hide. His face was lined deep with age, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Old Raven. He didn't smile, but his expression softened when he saw Boone. "Thought you were bones in the snow," he said. Boone offered a hand. "Been a long time." Raven looked past him to Mabel, who stood still beside the mule, unsure whether to approach. The elder studied her like a man reading a story carved in stone. "She yours?" Boone shook his head. "Not by blood." Raven nodded once. "But by choice." He stepped forward, his voice low and kind. "You have walked far, little one. Farther than most grown men walk in a lifetime." Then, from around his neck he removed a small pendant, carved from bone and strung with braided leather. The shape was simple, a bird in flight. He placed it gently in Mabel's palm. "This is for new beginnings, and for remembering who you are." The tears came fast, hot down her cheeks. She clutched the pendant like a lifeline, unable to speak. Raven's granddaughters came laughing from the river, their feet bare, skirts damp from play. They saw Mabel and without hesitation pulled her into their circle. Music played from a wooden flute nearby. Someone beat a drum in rhythm with the earth. Mabel didn't know the steps, but she followed. She laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. Boone stood back, arms folded, watching her spin among the girls, her hair flying, her eyes bright. "She ain't the same girl," he said. Raven stood beside him, arms behind his back. "Neither are you." That night they rode back under stars so thick they looked poured from a pail. Mabel clutched the pendant against her chest, and Boone's silence felt warmer than it ever had. The next morning, Boone spread old papers across the table. Maps, land deeds, letters worn thin with time. He dipped a quill in ink and began to write, slow and methodical. Names, dates, witnesses, truths the world had tried to bury. Mabel didn't interrupt. She didn't need to know every word. Instead, she took up her carving tools and sat by the fire. Her hands worked with purpose now, shaping wood into creatures that seemed almost alive. Foxes with curious eyes, owls in mid-flight, a bear with a cub nestled close. Each curve she carved was steadier than the last, each line more confident. She wasn't just shaping wood, she was shaping herself. And Boone, though he said little, kept glancing over, as if watching something grow. Whit Dyer returned to Ravel's Gap with a letter folded tight in his coat pocket and a glint of triumph behind his gold-rimmed spectacles. The papers he carried bore the seal of the county court, stamped, signed, and slick with deceit. A claim had been filed, one that laid Boone Callister's land open for seizure by eminent domain. The ink was fresh, but the lies were old and deep. Witnesses had been bought, signatures forged, maps redrawn by trembling hands greased with coin. All Dyer had to do now was push it through with a nod from the town. The mayor called a meeting, as was custom when trouble stepped too close to the border of decency. The town hall filled quickly, shopkeepers, ranchers, wives in aprons, boys with dirt on their cheeks, and girls peeking from behind skirts. Curiosity brought them. Fear kept them quiet. Dyer stood tall in front of the crowd, his coat crisp, his boots shining even on a muddy floor. He laid the papers down like a gambler laying his final card. "Progress is coming," he said smoothly. "The rail will bring goods, money, future. And this man, this Boone Callister, well, he's in the way." Mabel's father nodded from the back, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his lips. The mayor, a thin man with thinning hair and a nervous twitch in his jaw, looked over the documents like a man pretending to understand their weight. "The law is clear," he murmured. "If the papers are sound, there ain't much to contest." Sheriff Trask leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He didn't speak, didn't move. His eyes flicked to the window, then to Dyer, then away again, neutral as smoke. Then came a voice, clear, strong, tired of being silent. Boone's done more for this valley than any man here, Widow Callis said, stepping forward. When the flood took my roof, it was Boone who helped rebuild it. When that fever came through, he brought herbs from the mountain. He's kept to himself, yes, but never once turned his back when it mattered. A few heads nodded. Others turned away. Someone scoffed near the front. Man's a ghost. Been gone a decade. What's he done lately? An old rancher spoke next, voice cracked from years of dust and wind. He fixed my fence after that blizzard 2 winters back. Didn't ask for nothing. Then a boy stood up, barely tall enough to see over the bench in front of him. My dog fell through the ice last winter, he said. Everyone said leave it. Boone went in and got him. Never said a word. Just handed me my dog. The room grew still. The mayor shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing. We can't run a town on feelings. Calla raised her chin. Then maybe it's time we remember what a town's supposed to feel like. The air changed, slow but certain. People looked at one another, not as strangers, but as neighbors. A line had been drawn, not by Boone, not by Dyer, but by the people who stood between them. And the dust on the floor seemed to rise and settle, waiting to see which side would step first. The church stood at the far edge of Ravel's Gap, weathered but steady, its whitewashed boards peeling in the sun, and its bell rusted silent from long neglect. But within its plain walls, the truth had been spoken more times than the courthouse ever dared. And so it was there Boone took Mabel, under a gray morning sky, with a leather-bound bundle tucked beneath his arm and the weight of the valley's future pressing on his shoulders. The preacher was a tall man with lines drawn deep around his mouth and eyes like cooled iron. He wore no collar, only a worn vest and a look that made men speak honestly or not at all. He met them at the doorway with a nod, stepping aside to let them in. Boone handed him the bundle without a word. The preacher untied the leather straps and unfolded the contents on the altar table. Papers yellowed with age, but clear in their meaning. Deeds bearing Boone's name and the land's borders, signed in ink long before the railroad had drawn its hunger across the map. Letters written by townsfolk long gone, speaking of trades and trusts, promises kept by handshakes and witnessed by firelight. The preacher ran a calloused hand over one page, reading in silence. His eyes lingered at the signature of a judge, long dead but still speaking through the curve of his name. This is solid, the preacher said finally, and they'll say it's dust. Boone said nothing, just waited. Mabel stepped forward, clutching her satchel like a shield. She opened it and pulled out her sketchbook, flipping through pages until she found what she wanted, the faces. The preacher raised an eyebrow as she laid them out, one by one on the table. 5 men, each one caught in charcoal lines sharp as knives. Scars, squints, curled sneers. Men who had crept through the trees and tested the traps. Men who would return. These, she said, voice quiet but clear, were at our cabin the night before last. He studied the drawings, picking each up with care. You got all this from memory? She nodded. He looked at her then, really looked. You have a gift, girl. Mabel's cheeks flushed. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel. I just draw what I see. The preacher held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded. That's enough. He turned to Boone. We'll hold a hearing. Here, 2 days from now. It's neutral ground. Let the town hear both sides. Let the truth breathe. Boone gave one slow nod. Word spread fast. By afternoon, it had reached every shop, every porch, every hand that still held doubt, and every heart starting to believe. The girl had drawings, the mountain man had papers, and the preacher had agreed to speak the truth where the law had turned away. Outside the church, people gathered in 2s and 3s, whispering behind gloved hands and glancing toward the hills. This wasn't just a squabble over land anymore. This was something deeper, older, a reckoning long overdue, and for the first time the town couldn't decide which way the dust would settle. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows along the cabin walls. The smell of pine smoke curled through the air, mingling with the scent of stew that had long since gone cold. Boone sat in his old chair, the one with the worn armrest and the squeak in its back leg, staring into the flames like they held answers to questions he couldn't quite ask. The hearing was set for morning, and the weight of it pressed on his shoulders like snow heavy on a sagging roof. Mabel sat at the table, her sketchbook open but untouched. She'd tried drawing to settle her thoughts, but her hands wouldn't hold still. The air felt thick, quiet, but not peaceful. Boone hadn't spoken much all day, and the silence between them now felt like the space before a storm. After a while, he broke it. "You don't have to be part of this," he said, voice rough. "Ain't your fight." Mabel turned to look at him, eyes steady in the firelight. "You think I'd leave now?" He met her gaze, unreadable for a moment. "They'll call you a liar," he said. "Call me worse." She stood and walked toward him, the sketchbook still in hand. "Let 'em," she said. "I'm not leaving the only place I've ever been wanted." The words landed like a stone in still water. Boone looked away, blinking harder than usual. His breath hitched, just once. No sob, just a small crack in the mountain of him. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small pouch, and opened it slowly. From within, he drew a thin chain, silver dulled with age, and a delicate pendant shaped like a falling leaf. He held it out to her in his broad, weathered hand. "This was Evelyn's," he said. "She wore it every day, even when we had nothing. Said it reminded her that things fall so they can grow again." Mabel took it with both hands, gentle as if she were holding breath itself. Her fingers closed around the charm. Her voice wavered. "She'd have liked you," Boone said, almost a whisper. "She had a heart for lost things. Thought they just needed someone to believe in them." Mabel pressed the necklace to her chest, tears stinging behind her eyes. She didn't say thank you. Words didn't feel big enough. Instead, she sat down beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and leaned her head just slightly against his arm. They sat like that for a long while, listening to the wind outside and the occasional crack of the fire. Then, faint at first, came the sound of footsteps, many of them, not hurried, not angry. Boone stood, stepping onto the porch, Mabel close behind. From the ridge above, soft lights began to appear, moving dots glowing warm against the dark tree line. Torches. One by one, villagers emerged along the trail, winding up the mountain like stars returned to earth. Old men in hats pulled low, mothers with baskets, young boys with sticks in hand like swords. At the front rode Widow Calla on her mule, holding her torch high. Behind her the preacher, face calm as ever. They didn't come with shouts or banners, just presence, just silent declaration. They came not to fight, but to stand. Mabel watched, breath caught, as the flames drew nearer. Beside her, Boone said nothing, but his hand found her shoulder, rested there, solid and sure. Tomorrow would bring judgment, but tonight they were not alone. The church hall had never been so full. Every bench was packed, every wall lined with folks who normally kept their heads down and their business quiet. But this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the kind of place Ravel's Gap wanted to be, and every soul there felt it. The preacher stood at the front, tall and solemn, the morning light slanting through the stained glass behind him. Boone sat on one side of the aisle, broad shoulders still, eyes steady. Mabel was beside him, the silver leaf necklace at her throat, her sketchbook clutched in her lap like a shield made of paper and will. Dyer took the other side, flanked by his hired men, his black coat pressed and spotless, his sneer sharp enough to cut wood. Mabel's father sat near him, arms folded, gaze flickering like a man unsure which side of the fire he should warm his hands by. "Let us begin," the preacher said, voice firm. Dyer wasted no time. He rose, clearing his throat like a man preparing to sing praises. "Gentlemen, ladies, what we have here is a simple matter of paperwork and progress. The deeds I present," he held up a folded document, too new to be as old as he claimed, "show clear transfer of land rights under regional development provisions. Boone Callister's cabin sits on land now required for expansion. There is nothing personal here, merely lawful acquisition." He handed the papers to the preacher, who examined them without expression. Then Boone stood. He said little, just approached with a worn folder tucked beneath his arm and laid it on the altar. Letters, contracts, maps dated and signed with ink, faded by time, but marked with the seal of truth. The preacher unfolded the top sheet slowly. "Dated 12 years ago," he murmured, "signed by Judge Harlan, witnessed by 3 elders of this very town." Dyer leaned forward. "Forgery," he said quickly. "That paper's been rotting in some cabin drawer. Anyone could have doctored it." Mabel rose then. Her voice was quiet, but it traveled the room. "I can show you the difference." She stepped forward and laid 2 sketches side by side. One was of Dyer's deed, the one he'd waved so proudly. The other, Boone's original. She had captured each curve, each ink mark, each inconsistency. Her pencil had spotted the change in font weight, the mismatched seal stamp, the smudge where a signature had been copied, not written. The preacher studied both sketches, holding them up. "One's truth," he said. "One's greed." A hush fell over the room. Dyer's mouth twitched. He reached into his coat, pulled out another letter, an accusation. But before he could speak, Widow Calla stepped forward. "I'd like to read something," she said, unfolding a worn letter. Boone didn't turn. He knew which one. It was a letter he'd written before leaving town, scrawled in sorrow, thick with regret. It spoke of love lost, of guilt carried, of land he vowed to protect, not for himself, but because it was the only thing left of the life he'd built with his wife and child. The room held its breath. When she finished, no one spoke, not even Dyer, until Sheriff Trask cleared his throat, finally lifting his gaze. "We were wrong," he said simply. "We judged a man before we buried the ashes." Dyer's face went red. He tried to gather his papers, stand, leave. But as he turned, the townsfolk blocked the door. Shoulder to shoulder. Silent. The line had been drawn, and this time, they stood on the side of right. The silence broke like glass. Dyer's hand moved fast, his suit jacket flaring open to reveal the glint of steel. The moment his fingers closed around the revolver at his side, gasps rang through the church hall like a storm of wings. Mothers clutched children, men stepped back, but Boone Callister didn't flinch. He moved with a speed no one expected from a man built like granite and years. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance, throwing his full weight into Dyer's chest. The gun went off, once deafening in the wood-beam room. The shot buried itself harmlessly into the floorboards. Boone and Dyer crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Benches overturned, paper flew, someone screamed. Mabel didn't hesitate. She dove forward, skirts catching on the pulpit rail, hands reaching for the revolver as it skidded across the floor. She grabbed it just before one of Dyer's hired men lunged toward her. But before he could reach her, Widow Calla struck him from behind with a broom handle, eyes blazing. Sheriff Trask was there next, pulling another man off Boone with surprising force. He drew his own weapon, leveled it at the last of Dyer's men, and said in a voice that brooked no argument, "Enough!" Dyer struggled beneath Boone's grip, red-faced, spit flecking his lips. "You people don't know what's good for you," he shouted. You'll rot in these hills while the world moves on. Boone's fist met his jaw with the weight of 10 winters. The preacher stepped forward, his coat flaring like a cloak. He stood tall at the altar, eyes sweeping the room, then dropped to the bundle of evidence and raised it high above the chaos. This land, he declared, voice booming, is rightfully Boone Callister's, and no law bought with gold or fear will change that. A hush fell, broken only by the heavy breathing of those who had fought, those who had stood. Sheriff Trask pulled Dyer to his feet, wrists now bound in rope. He'll be held. A proper trial will follow. This time we let justice breathe. Mabel stood trembling, the revolver still clutched in her hands. Boone turned to her, blood on his knuckles, dust on his coat. He gently took the gun from her, then wrapped his large, calloused hand around hers. She gripped it back like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away. Then slowly the room erupted, not in fear, not in confusion, but in something else. Applause. It began with the old rancher in the corner, then a young mother, then the preacher. A steady rhythm of hands clapping, boots stamping, the kind of sound that meant more than approval. It meant belonging. Mabel's father had once called her useless, but now standing in the middle of the town's old church hall, her fingers curled into Boone's palm, Mabel understood something different. She had helped save the valley, and the valley at last saw her. The climb back to the ridge was slow and quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a blanket. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have only crowded the peace. The valley lay behind them now, justice settled, dust kicked up by fear finally resting. The path beneath their feet was firm, the mountain cool with the breath of early winter. Mabel carried a small bundle in her arms, roots wrapped in burlap, the sapling Boone had helped her pick. Not too tall, not too young, just enough to survive the wind up here. Boone walked beside her with a spade strapped to his back, his gait easy, shoulders looser than she'd ever seen them. The cabin rose into view, smoke curling lazily from its chimney, and just beyond it, the clearing. The graves were where they'd always been, two wooden crosses, weathered and worn but standing strong. Mabel knelt between them, brushing fallen pine needles away from the soil. She placed the sapling gently between the crosses and looked up at Boone. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded and handed her the spade. They dug side by side, no ceremony, no speech, just earth turned by patient hands. When the hole was ready, Mabel set the tree in place, straightening it with care, then packed the dirt around it. Boone poured water from a canteen. When it was done, they stepped back. "A tree for them," she said softly. "Something to grow." Boone's voice came low. "Something to stay." They stood for a while, watching the branches flutter slightly in the breeze. Then Boone turned and walked to the cabin, disappearing inside. Mabel followed, curious but silent. He knelt by the hearth and pulled out a carved wooden chest, its lid marked with symbols Mabel didn't recognize, but that had clearly been etched with love and time. He opened it slowly. Inside, folded with care, were tiny garments, baby clothes, hand-stitched with thread faded from years but still soft to the touch. A bonnet, a pair of moccasins no bigger than her palm, a blanket embroidered with little stars. Mabel sank beside him, her fingers trembling as she touched the fabric. She didn't speak at first. Her throat felt too full. Then with a voice just above a whisper, she said, "You don't have to forget." Boone didn't look at her. His hand rested on the edge of the chest, knuckles white. "You gave me a reason to remember," he said. He closed the lid gently. Outside, the sky had shifted to gray, and snow began to fall in quiet flakes, light as ash. Mabel spent the afternoon building. She selected the pine boards herself, cut them with Boone's help, sanded the edges and fitted them together into a sturdy bench. She carved 2 names into the backrest, Evelyn and Lucy, and beneath them, a simple phrase, still loved. Together they carried the bench to the edge of the ridge, facing the valley. They sat side by side, wrapped in coats and shared silence. The tree behind them stood tall, the graves nestled beneath it, and the snow began to coat the ground in a soft blanket. But somehow it didn't feel cold. Not anymore. Winter melted slow that year, not in a rush, but gently, like the mountain itself had decided to exhale. Ice retreated from the riverbanks, and crocuses pushed their purple heads through the thawing soil. The people of Ravel's Gap moved with the season, slower at first, as if afraid the peace might vanish if they looked too directly at it. But it didn't. Instead, something long buried began to rise. The old church house reopened its side wing, and from its splintered floors and broken windows came a new sound: children's laughter. Widow Calla, skirts dusted in chalk and hair always coming loose, stood at the front of the room with a piece of slate in one hand and a reader in the other. She taught letters in the morning and numbers in the afternoon, and when her voice grew hoarse, she'd turn to Mabel. Mabel never asked for the children's attention. She earned it by kneeling beside them, guiding their hands as they shaped their first drawings, praising their crooked sons and three-legged dogs with the same care she once craved herself. They watched her with wide eyes, some too small to remember her arrival, but old enough to know she mattered. In the evenings, baskets began appearing at the edge of Boone's cabin. No notes, just offerings, jars of beans, bundles of turnips, coils of rope, sacks of nails. One day a family left behind a sack of grain and a single seedling in a pot carved with the initials B and M. Mabel found it first and cried. Boone didn't say much about the gifts. He just set his tools to use. He helped rebuild the Anderson barn after the roof gave way under spring rains. He cut fence posts for the Lyle family, even though they'd once whispered loudest against him. He said little, just nodded and went back to work. Mabel visited the graves often. One morning she brought her carving tools and a soft piece of walnut from the shed. She sat beside the little tree they'd planted, now budding in green, and etched each letter slow and sure. When it was done, she planted the plaque deep in the soil beside the crosses. The words were simple: "Here lies love. Here lives hope." Later that week, a young couple came by with their infant child and left a bouquet of daisies at the foot of the tree. Mabel stood at the window and watched them from a distance, her hand pressed to her chest. She didn't call out. She didn't have to. Then came the council vote. The mayor, red-faced and sheepish now, read the nomination aloud at the town meeting: Boone Callister for community councilman. The room stirred. Heads turned toward Boone, who sat at the back, arms crossed, face unreadable. "I ain't one for speeches," Boone said, standing slowly. "And I ain't one for titles." A pause. "But she is." He turned and placed a weathered hand on Mabel's shoulder. She stood beside him, tall and still in her hand-sewn dress and boots she'd outgrown. Her voice didn't shake. "I'll serve," she said. "For him. For all of you." No one clapped. Not at first. But then a small child, one of the boys from the schoolhouse, stood and said, "She's the reason I can read." That's when the hands began to come together, a slow growing rhythm that filled the hall and spilled out into the street. Hope had taken root in Ravel's Gap, and this time it was here to stay. The seasons turned with quiet dignity, and the mountains softened under spring's gentle insistence. Wildflowers bloomed where frost once clung, and the wind carried less bite, more song. Time passed, not fast, not slow, just true, and with it, the girl who had once stumbled behind Boone Callister in the underbrush became a woman who walked ahead with purpose in her step and warmth in her voice. Mabel stood tall now, strong from labor, wiser from pain endured and kindness received. Her shoulders no longer slumped beneath shame. Her hands were rough from work, but steady with purpose. She wore the pendant Raven had given her like a badge, its simple symbol of flight resting over her heart. She was showing a group of children how to carve, kneeling beside a stump near the edge of the clearing. Their little hands trembled over soft pine blocks, eyes squinting in concentration. Mabel guided them gently, her voice calm, her praise sincere. One of the boys, a wiry child with freckles and quick fingers, paused to look up at her. "Miss Mabel," he said, "my pa said you saved our land. Said them railroad men would have taken it if you and Mr. Boone hadn't stood up." Mabel smiled, not wide but deep. "Your pa's land was never theirs to take," she said. "You all just needed to be seen." He nodded solemnly and went back to whittling. A short distance away, Boone leaned against the fence he'd built last fall, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. His beard had gone mostly gray, his eyes softer now, though no less sharp. He still wore the same coat, still moved with the caution of a man who knew how to survive in silence. But there was something looser in the way he stood, something that no longer braced against the world. "She's something, ain't she?" Calla said, coming to stand beside him. Boone didn't look away from Mabel. "She saved me." Calla nodded, arms folded across her apron. "That girl's got iron and honey in her bones, just like Evelyn did." Boone's jaw tensed at the name, but he didn't flinch. He only nodded again. The cabin had changed too. It was no longer just a home for two. Word had spread through the valley and beyond, of a place where those with nowhere to go could find shelter, where orphans left by hardship and outcasts marked by cruelty might come and find something rare, belonging. There was always food on the table, always a bed, even if it was straw and blankets near the hearth. Mabel had painted a sign in careful letters and hung it over the cabin's front door. Hearth Hollow. Below it, carved by Boone's steady hand, "Welcome home." The forest, once heavy with grief, felt lighter now. The birds sang clearer. The deer ventured closer. Even the wind through the pines seemed less mournful. It was as if the land itself had taken a breath, healed a little with each step Mabel took across its soil. And Boone, who had once counted his life by what he had lost, now counted it by the warmth in her voice, the laughter of children echoing off the trees, in the quiet peace that came from having someone to build a future beside. The mountain hadn't changed, but the man on it had. The sun rose soft and golden over the valley, casting long, warm rays through budding trees and across the wildflowers that blanketed the meadow in bursts of color. The breeze smelled of new growth, damp earth, lilac, the first green shoots of wild mint, and the world seemed to exhale in peace. It was the kind of day that made sorrow feel far away, like something that had only ever existed in stories. Mabel stood just outside the cabin, hammer in hand, holding a sign she'd painted the night before. She pressed it gently against the beam above the porch and nailed it into place with 3 careful swings. The wood was smooth and polished, the letters painted in a soft, earthy red. It read, "Hearth Hollow, a home for the lost." She stepped back to admire it, brushes still tucked behind her ear, apron smudged with the colors of the morning. A little boy tugged at her skirt with one hand and held a half-carved bear in the other. She knelt down and helped him steady his grip, guiding his fingers where to carve next. Just off the porch, Boone sat in his rocker, a block of cedar resting in his large hands. His knife moved with the slow precision of someone who had learned the rhythm of stillness, each motion confident and steady. Bit by bit, a shape emerged beneath the blade. Shoulders broad, chin raised, hair pulled back into a braid. A girl, proud, strong. He didn't have to say who it was. Travelers had started coming up the trail more often now, some alone, some with children in tow, many with little more than what they carried on their backs. They'd arrived quiet, worn, unsure. But when they saw the sign, when they heard the laughter of children playing in the grass, or smelled bread baking in the hearth, they'd stop, and they'd stay. Townsfolk came too, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Calla visited twice a week with fresh eggs and always stayed for a cup of tea. The preacher brought books. Even Sheriff Trask, still awkward in his way, had been by to patch a window and fix a loose hinge, without saying much more than a grunt and a nod. Mabel sat beside Boone with her paint set balanced on her lap, her fingers stained in blues and greens. She was finishing a small canvas, two trees growing side by side, their roots tangled beneath a sunrise. Boone paused his carving. She looked up at him, a little smile pulling at her lips. "Think they'll remember us?" she asked. He turned the figurine in his hands, brushed a curl of wood from its shoulder. "They already do," he said. Mabel leaned back, watching the children run through the tall grass, the wind carrying their laughter up toward the ridge and beyond. Somewhere, far past those hills, the voice that once called her a burden had gone quiet, lost in the noise of a world too full of its own cruelties. But here, in this place they built with scars and patience, there was only kindness. And that kindness echoed now, soft, steady, and strong, through every carved step. Every painted corner, every new beginning made in the home for the lost.